It was a quiet morning when the knock on the door broke the silence of the suburban neighborhood. The protagonist, a U.S. Marshal who had just moved in a few weeks ago, wasn't expecting visitors. It had been a long time since they'd experienced the kind of peacefulness that only a quiet neighborhood could provide. The house was modest but cozy, nestled among the perfectly manicured lawns and pastel-colored homes. It was the perfect place to leave behind the hustle and danger of their previous life. But something about the atmosphere felt different, too calm, as if there was an unspoken tension in the air. The protagonist opened the door, and standing there, smiling too wide, was Karen. "Oh, you must be the new neighbor," she exclaimed, her voice saccharine and far too chipper. "Welcome to the community." Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, was known for two things: her meticulously controlled demeanor and her obsession with enforcing every microscopic rule of the HOA's outdated and arbitrary policies. She was infamous for making residents' lives a nightmare over trivial matters like a misplaced trash can or a slightly overgrown lawn. Her power within the community was absolute, or so she thought. The protagonist smiled politely, but kept their distance. "Thank you. We're just getting settled in." Karen's smile never wavered, but her eyes scanned the front yard. Specifically, the small garden gnome standing proudly near the flower bed. It was a harmless decoration, just a quirky piece that added a touch of personality to the otherwise traditional landscaping. But Karen's eyes narrowed slightly as her gaze lingered on it. "I couldn't help but notice," Karen said, stepping forward as if she had the right to inspect the property, "that your garden gnome is, well, a little out of place." She paused dramatically. "It's against the HOA's guidelines, you know. We've had a lot of complaints about this sort of thing." The protagonist raised an eyebrow, not sure whether to laugh or be annoyed. "A garden gnome. Of all the things to take issue with. I don't think it's a problem," the protagonist replied, keeping their tone neutral, though a hint of frustration was creeping in. "It's just a gnome." Karen smiled that too-perfect smile again, but there was something colder behind it now, something sharp. "Oh, you'll see. It's all about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. Trust me, we've had to remove other things before, and people didn't always take it well. But don't worry. I'm just giving you a friendly warning." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You wouldn't want to start off on the wrong foot with the HOA, would you?" There it was, the unspoken threat, the subtle power play that Karen had perfected over the years. The protagonist's instincts flared, but they kept their expression neutral. This wasn't the kind of fight they were looking for. Not yet. "I'll keep that in mind," the protagonist said, and Karen, sensing the lack of compliance, turned on her heel and walked away without another word. But just before she disappeared around the corner of the house, she called back, her voice carrying with a strange finality. "I'll be in touch." The protagonist stood there, staring after her. Something wasn't right. The way she'd spoken, the chill in her tone, the subtle threats buried beneath her words, it all pointed to one thing. Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was a woman used to getting her way, and she wasn't about to let a new neighbor with a gnome stand in her path. As the protagonist closed the door, they felt the familiar weight of tension settle on their shoulders. This was only the beginning, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she had control. The question wasn't if this would escalate, it was when. The days that followed Karen's visit were uneventful, but an uneasy feeling lingered. The protagonist went about their routine, unpacking boxes and setting up their new life, but there was an undercurrent of tension. Every time they stepped outside, they could almost feel Karen's eyes on them, as though she were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The garden gnome, seemingly such a harmless decoration, had become the symbol of an unspoken battle. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. It was tucked into the mailbox, neatly folded, with the HOA's official letterhead stamped in bold letters. The protagonist's stomach tightened as they reached for it, the familiar weight of an impending conflict settling in. Opening the letter, They read through Karen's scathing complaint. "Dear resident, it has come to our attention that your yard is in violation of HOA guidelines. Specifically, we have received multiple complaints regarding the garden gnome in your front yard. This constitutes a breach of Rule 17B, which prohibits any lawn decorations that do not conform to neighborhood aesthetics. Failure to comply with this request within 48 hours will result in a fine and potential legal action. Sincerely, Karen Hayes, HOA President." The letter felt like a slap in the face. Multiple complaints. From whom? The neighbors? The protagonist hadn't spoken to anyone except for Karen, and it seemed unlikely that anyone would be bothered by a simple gnome. But there it was, in black and white. A formal threat. The protagonist's first instinct was to ignore it. After all, it was just a gnome. But then the words "legal action" stood out. Karen wasn't bluffing. As they stared at the letter, a slow realization crept in. This wasn't about the gnome. This was about power. Karen had likely chosen a petty battle to test the waters, to see how far she could push before the protagonist caved. And judging by her tone, it was clear she thought the protagonist would fold under pressure. The next day, as if on cue, the knock came. The protagonist opened the door to find two men standing in the doorway, both wearing uniforms with the HOA logo stitched on the chest. The taller of the two, a burly man with a buzz cut, spoke first, his voice overly authoritative for someone not in law enforcement. "Good afternoon," he said. "We're here on behalf of the HOA Enforcement Division." He glanced at the protagonist's front yard, his gaze narrowing at the gnome. "We've been instructed to inform you that the garden gnome must be removed immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action." The second man, shorter and stockier, stayed silent but looked over the protagonist's shoulder into the house, a hint of intimidation in his eyes. The protagonist, now on high alert, didn't let their surprise show. These men weren't in official uniforms. The outfits looked hastily put together, with the stitching on the logos slightly uneven, as if they were hastily fabricated. Their mannerisms felt rehearsed, almost like they were playing a role. Something wasn't right. "Who are you?" the protagonist asked, narrowing their eyes. "I don't recall seeing an HOA Enforcement Division. Can I see your identification?" The two men exchanged uneasy glances. The taller man cleared his throat, his hand shifting nervously toward his belt. "We don't carry IDs, but trust us, we're with the HOA. We've been sent here to handle the matter. This is a serious issue." The protagonist's heart began to race. This was no ordinary complaint. They could feel the weight of the situation shift. This wasn't just about a garden gnome anymore. Something darker was at play. The protagonist remained calm, stepping back from the door. "I'll need to verify your identities first. You can't just show up and make threats without proof." The men's smiles faltered. The taller one shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the street as if he were trying to gauge whether anyone was watching. The tension was thick, the air almost crackling with unease. Something was about to break, and the protagonist knew it wouldn't be good. "Listen, just get rid of the gnome," the shorter man grumbled, "and we won't have to escalate this." The protagonist's instincts screamed that this wasn't an ordinary HOA dispute. Karen had sent fake enforcers to intimidate them. But why? The question hung in the air, unspoken yet urgent. What was she really after? The protagonist stood frozen at the door, watching as the two men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking nervously between the gnome and the protagonist. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with tension. "Who sent you?" the protagonist asked, their voice calm but firm. They had no intention of backing down. Not now. Not for something as ridiculous as a garden gnome. The taller man, his face reddening, cleared his throat. We're with the HOA. Like I said, we were just sent to, handle things. Handle things." The protagonist stepped closer, lowering their voice. "You're not even wearing official uniforms. And you don't have any ID. You're not with the HOA, are you? The two men exchanged another glance, and for the first time, it was obvious that they were caught off guard. The shorter man stepped forward, trying to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. "Look, we don't have time for this. You're just making things harder for yourself." The gnome. The protagonist cut him off. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, and you're not from the HOA. Now, if you don't get off my property and tell me who sent you, I'm going to call the police." The two men went rigid. The taller one, who had been doing most of the talking, hesitated before slowly backing away. You're a marshal," he muttered, his voice cracking. "We didn't know. We were just following orders." "Orders from who?" The protagonist pressed, the realization beginning to hit them. This wasn't just about the gnome. This was something more sinister. The men turned to leave, but the protagonist, now fully alert, stepped outside and pulled out their badge. The gleam of it in the sunlight caught their attention, and they finally backed away. As they scurried down the porch steps, the protagonist snapped a picture of their faces with their phone, just in case. They barely made it down the sidewalk before the protagonist picked up their phone and dialed the local police. They needed to know who these imposters were. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone go to such lengths for a harmless decoration? By the time the police arrived, the men had vanished, their fake uniforms left behind like hollow shells. The protagonist spoke to the officers, explaining the situation and showing them the picture. But even as the officers promised to investigate further, the unease didn't dissipate. In fact, it grew. The protagonist had been through enough dangerous situations in their career to recognize the telltale signs of something bigger brewing. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. Karen had sent these men with a purpose. But what was it? Was this just a power play, or did she have something more to hide? As the police left, the protagonist stood at the door, staring at the empty street, still grasping the weight of what had just happened. Who was really behind this? And more importantly, why were they willing to go so far for something as petty as a garden gnome? The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was something about Karen, something dark that hadn't yet revealed itself, and the protagonist wasn't going to let it go until they found out exactly what. Days passed after the encounter with the fake HOA officers, but the unease never fully lifted. The protagonist knew Karen wasn't done. It wasn't just about the gnome anymore. She had crossed a line. The more they thought about it, the clearer it became that Karen was playing a far more dangerous game than just enforcing trivial HOA rules. With the police investigation still in its early stages, the protagonist decided to take matters into their own hands. They weren't going to wait around for someone else to uncover Karen's motives. No, they would dig into her history themselves, find out what was really going on. The first place they started was with the HOA's official documents. The protagonist spent hours combing through outdated rules and bylaws, searching for anything unusual. It wasn't long before they found something suspicious. Several clauses in the HOA's financial records seemed off. There were irregular payments, unexplained expenditures, and fees that were far higher than necessary for basic neighborhood maintenance. And at the center of it all, Karen's signature. It was enough to make the protagonist's skin crawl. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was stealing from the very people she claimed to be protecting. The protagonist decided to confront the HOA board, hoping to put the pressure on them and find some allies. They had already gathered the evidence of financial mismanagement and were ready to expose her. The board, made up of well-to-do residents, was known for being overly complacent, but surely they wouldn't tolerate outright theft. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and the protagonist spent the days leading up to it preparing. They meticulously organized all the documents, making sure they had everything in order. But as the day of the meeting drew closer, the tension only grew. There was no doubt in their mind now. This wasn't just about a gnome. Karen had built a web of deceit, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear it down without a fight. When the day of the HOA meeting arrived, The protagonist walked into the sterile conference room with a sense of determination. Karen was already there, sitting at the head of the table, looking smug as usual. She didn't seem worried. But then again, she had no reason to. She was still the president of the HOA, and in her mind, no one dared challenge her. As the meeting began, Karen addressed the group with her usual charm. She smiled, she spoke with authority, and she commanded attention, but the protagonist could see the subtle cracks in her facade. When Karen's eyes briefly met theirs, there was something behind them, something that flickered for just a moment. Fear. The protagonist waited until the right moment, then stood up, clearing their throat to gain the room's attention. "I've come across something disturbing," they began, their voice steady but forceful. "Karen has been embezzling funds from the HOA. These documents," the protagonist said, pulling out the financial records, "prove that she's been siphoning money from the neighborhood maintenance fees for years." The room went dead silent. Karen's smile faltered, and for the first time, she looked like she was losing control. But she quickly recovered, her eyes flashing with malice. "That's a lie," she spat, her voice tight. "This is nothing but an attempt to discredit me." But the protagonist was ready. They placed the financial records in front of the board, each page clearly showing the discrepancies. The evidence was undeniable. The board members began to murmur amongst themselves, their expressions turning from skepticism to disbelief. Karen's face reddened. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. The power she'd held over the board and the neighborhood was slipping away, bit by bit. But as the tension in the room grew, the protagonist knew this wouldn't be over quickly. Karen wouldn't give up without a fight, and she was far from defeated. This was just the first step. As the meeting broke up, the protagonist lingered, watching Karen storm out of the room, her face twisted in rage. The smell of victory was in the air, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the real battle was still ahead. The protagonist wasn't just fighting for their right to keep a gnome in their yard. They were fighting for the truth. And Karen, for all her bravado, was about to find out that the truth was far more dangerous than any garden decoration. The following days after the HOA meeting were filled with whispers and tension. Word of the protagonist's confrontation with Karen spread quickly through the neighborhood, and many of the residents, those who had previously feared Karen's influence, began to question her authority. But Karen wasn't going to let this slip by. She was smart, ruthless, and now more dangerous than ever. The protagonist knew this wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. After the meeting, Karen had retreated into the shadows, her public persona of control slipping slightly. But the protagonist could feel the storm brewing, and they had no illusions. Karen would strike back, and it would be worse than anything they'd faced so far. The first sign came when the protagonist received another letter from the HOA. This time, the message was clear. Karen was coming for them, personally. "Dear resident, this is your final warning. The violation of HOA rules has escalated far beyond the acceptable boundaries. If you do not remove the garden gnome and cease your harassment of the HOA, we will be forced to take legal action. This will include a lawsuit and additional fines. Sincerely, Karen Hayes, HOA President." The protagonist knew the letter was empty, another attempt at intimidation, nothing more. But something about it felt different. The language was sharper, colder, and the warning more threatening than before. There was no longer any pretense of subtlety. Karen had decided to go on the offensive, to push her power to the limit. The protagonist decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear their mind and gauge the atmosphere. As they strolled past familiar homes, a sense of unease settled in. It wasn't just the pressure from Karen's increasing hostility. It was the strange feeling that everyone was watching. The seemingly perfect picture postcard neighborhood now felt like a stage, with everyone playing a role in a twisted drama. As the protagonist reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood, they saw a figure in the distance, standing by a bench, staring intently in their direction. The figure was Karen. The protagonists stopped in their tracks, not wanting to make it obvious they had seen her, but Karen was already walking towards them with purpose. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "I thought we could have a little chat," Karen said, her tone eerily calm. "You've made quite a mess of things. You've poked the hornet's nest, and now you're going to pay the price." The protagonist's pulse quickened. They'd known this conversation was coming. "What do you want, Karen?" Karen's lips curled into a tight smile. "I want you to leave this neighborhood. That gnome. It's nothing compared to what's coming next." Her voice dropped lower, her words cutting through the air. "I've got enough dirt on you to ruin your entire life. Your little badge won't protect you when I'm through." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist, who had faced countless dangers in their career as a U.S. Marshal, suddenly realized the depth of Karen's reach. She wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was a manipulator, capable of digging up whatever dirt she needed to destroy lives. "I'm not going anywhere," the protagonist said, their voice steady despite the rising adrenaline. "You've already shown your hand, Karen. Whatever you're planning won't work." But Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost delighted. "We'll see about that. Just remember, you're the one who started this war. And when I win, there won't be a thing you can do about it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the protagonist standing there, still processing the weight of her words. It was clear now. Karen wasn't just trying to force the protagonist out of the neighborhood. She was playing a far more dangerous game, one that involved far more than just the HOA's rules, and the protagonist had no choice but to meet her head-on. As Karen disappeared into the distance, the protagonist's resolve solidified. This wasn't about the gnome. This wasn't even about the neighborhood. This was about survival. The days following the confrontation with Karen felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. The neighborhood, once quiet and picturesque, now felt like a powder keg, with Karen at the center of it all. The protagonist had done everything right, gathered evidence, stood up for what was right, but now it seemed as if Karen was going to take this fight to dangerous, unforeseen extremes. Karen had made it clear. She wasn't just playing petty games anymore. She was prepared to destroy the protagonist's life, using whatever tools she had at her disposal. The protagonist didn't know whether to be angry or terrified. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to back down. The protagonist spent the following days in a quiet, intense state of preparation. They doubled down on their investigation, looking into Karen's finances and her connections. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the details became. Karen had been manipulating not just the HOA's funds, but had her fingers in several shady dealings around the neighborhood: bribery, intimidation, and even blackmail. Her power wasn't just limited to the HOA. She had a network, and that made her dangerous. But the worst part, Karen had gotten wind of the protagonist's digging. It wasn't just the HOA board she was watching. Karen had hired someone, likely one of her own goons, to track the protagonist's every move. One evening, as the protagonists sat in their study, reviewing documents, they heard a faint noise outside, like the sound of someone trying to be discreet. They stood up and went to the window, peering through the blinds. There in the dimming twilight, a black car was parked across the street, just out of sight. The headlights were off, but the engine hummed quietly. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for days. Heart racing, the protagonist grabbed their phone and snapped a quick picture of the car. Whoever was out there, they weren't just trying to intimidate. They were hunting. The protagonist knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to confront Karen directly, and they had to do it on their terms. The next morning, they called in a favor. A fellow U.S. Marshal owed them a solid, and it was time to cash in. They needed backup, someone who knew how to move quickly and discreetly. After a quick conversation, their contact agreed to help, though the protagonist could sense the tension on the other end of the line. "This isn't just about a garden gnome anymore, is it?" the Marshal asked. "No," the protagonist replied. their voice grim. "This is a war, and Karen's playing dirty." Later that afternoon, they drove to a quiet coffee shop outside of town. The plan was simple: get in, get the intel they needed, and get out before Karen's people could respond. But nothing with Karen was ever simple. The coffee shop was a front. When the protagonist and their Marshal contact arrived, they were greeted not with the quiet murmur of coffee drinkers, but with the presence of a heavily armed security detail. It was clear Karen had anticipated this move. As they sat down to discuss their next steps, the air in the room grew tense. The protagonist's pulse quickened. They couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the demeanor of the Marshal. Something wasn't right. Before they could react, the lights in the coffee shop flickered, and the door slammed open. A group of men, dressed in dark suits and sunglasses, stormed in. Karen had set a trap, and the protagonist had just walked right into it. The protagonist barely had time to react as the men moved quickly, surrounding them. The Marshal beside them went for his weapon, but one of the men knocked it out of his hand in a swift move. The cold realization hit like a ton of bricks. Karen wasn't just sending goons. She was using every resource available to break them. As the men closed in, the protagonist's mind raced, calculating their next move. It wasn't just about escaping now. It was about taking the fight to Karen, once and for all. The tension in the coffee shop was unbearable. The men in dark suits closed in like a pack of wolves, their eyes fixed on the protagonist with cold intent. The protagonist's muscles tensed, their mind working quickly to process the situation. They'd been ambushed. There was no escaping this. One of the men, a broad-shouldered figure with a steely gaze, took a step forward. "You're in the wrong place," he said, his voice low and threatening. The protagonist kept their face impassive, masking the surge of adrenaline that coursed through them. There was only one option left: fight. Before the man could make another move, the protagonist shot a glance at their Marshal contact, who was still recovering from the surprise attack. Without warning, the protagonist sprang into action, knocking over their chair and using it as a shield to push through the group. One of the goons lunged at them, but the protagonist sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and throwing him against the nearby counter. The crash was deafening. A second attacker swung at the protagonist with a fist, but they ducked just in time, delivering a swift elbow to the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. The goon crumpled to the floor, but the remaining attackers didn't hesitate, closing in on the protagonist with lethal precision. The Marshal beside them finally recovered his weapon, drawing it in one smooth motion. He took a step back, raising his gun in the air. "This is your last chance," he warned, his voice steady but authoritative. The remaining goons paused for a split second, their hands hovering near their own weapons. It was clear they didn't expect a fight this intense. But the momentary hesitation was all the protagonist needed. They grabbed a nearby coffee pot from a table and hurled it at the lead goon's head, temporarily stunning him. The protagonist didn't waste a second. Grabbing a nearby metal chair leg, they swung it with force, knocking out the remaining attackers one by one. The leader of the group, still dazed from the coffee pot, was the last to stand. "You think you can just walk out of here and get away with it?" He spat, wiping blood from his lip. The protagonist's eyes narrowed. "It's you who should be worried about getting away with it. Karen's days are numbered." Suddenly, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The local authorities had been notified, thanks to the Marshal's backup, and they were closing in fast. The goons knew their time was up. The leader glanced at the exit, but the protagonist stepped in front of him, blocking the door. "It's over," they said, their voice firm. "You can either walk out and surrender, or we can do this the hard way." The leader hesitated, then lowered his head in defeat. Without another word, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands, signaling the end of the confrontation. The rest of his team followed suit, surrendering one by one. As the police arrived, the scene shifted from chaos to control. The protagonists stood, catching their breath, as the officers took the goons into custody. The Marshal remained by their side, his gaze scanning the room, making sure the threat had been neutralized. "That was close," the Marshal muttered, holstering his weapon. "You're lucky we got here when we did." But the protagonist wasn't relieved, not yet. They knew that this skirmish wasn't the final battle. Karen was still out there, pulling the strings. And now it was personal. As the authorities processed the arrests, the protagonist made a quiet vow. Karen had crossed a line, and they weren't stopping until she paid for everything she'd done. But what the protagonist didn't know was that Karen was already one step ahead. She wasn't just a manipulative HOA president. She was a master strategist. And she had a backup plan, one that would hit the protagonist harder than they ever expected. The dust had barely settled from the chaotic confrontation at the coffee shop, but the protagonist knew this was far from over. Karen had lost her goons, but she wasn't the type to admit defeat. The feeling of triumph that had washed over the protagonist was quickly replaced with an unsettling sense of dread. Karen would retaliate. And when she did, it would be lethal. As the authorities processed the goons and began to gather evidence, the protagonist stood on the periphery, mentally preparing for what was coming next. The Marshal had ensured that everything was in order. Karen's hired muscle was in custody. The evidence of her criminal activities was being collected. But the protagonist knew the truth. The real battle was still ahead. They called in another favor, this time reaching out to their colleagues at the U.S. Marshal's office. They needed intel on Karen, every piece of it. There was no way she was just a local HOA president, using her position to manipulate and steal. The deeper they looked, the more they realized Karen was deeply embedded in criminal networks, her operations spanning beyond the HOA and into dark, murky territories. It was early the next morning when the call came in. The Marshal on the other end sounded grim. "We've got a lead. One of Karen's old associates just made a deal to cooperate. They're talking about something bigger than just neighborhood scams. She's involved in high-level corruption, possibly even organized crime." The protagonist's mind raced. Karen was a mastermind, a criminal who'd been playing the long game, carefully constructing a web of lies and manipulation. But now, that web was starting to unravel. "You need to take her down now, before she realizes we're onto her," the Marshal urged. "This thing is much bigger than we thought. She's been laundering money through fake HOA fees, but there's something else. Her connections go way beyond the neighborhood." The protagonist nodded, determination settling in. "I know what I have to do." It was time for the final confrontation. Karen had set her trap, but now it was the protagonist's turn to set one of their own. Later that day, the protagonist, accompanied by a small team of trusted colleagues, staked out Karen's mansion. It was a massive, ostentatious house. Everything about it screamed power. The perfect place for someone like Karen to hide in plain sight. The team had gathered intel on her whereabouts, and tonight, they were going in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they moved in. The mansion was eerily quiet, the exterior lit with soft floodlights. The protagonist's heart pounded as they approached the front door. They knew Karen was likely inside, making her final moves. This was their last chance to end it. The team breached the door, swiftly entering the house. Inside, it was like walking into a fortress. Everything about the place screamed wealth and influence. They moved quietly through the rooms, sweeping every corner. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. At the back of the house, in a grand study, they found her. Karen was sitting at a large desk, a look of disbelief on her face as she slowly turned to face them. She hadn't expected them to be this close, this fast. But there was no escape for her now. "I know everything," the protagonist said, their voice cold and resolute. "The money, the schemes, the connections. You're finished." Karen stood, her face twisted with fury, but there was something else there too. Fear. She had never expected to be cornered like this. Not by the protagonist, and certainly not by the truth. "You think you've won," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You don't know what you're messing with." I'll destroy you, everyone, if it's the last thing I do." But her words were hollow. The moment the evidence of her criminal empire was handed over, it was over. The truth had finally caught up to Karen. As her fate began to seal with the arrest, the protagonist felt the weight of everything they had fought for. Justice had been served, but it had come at a price. As the authorities took Karen into custody, the protagonist stood at the edge of the property, watching the chaos unfold. The battle was over, but they knew one thing for sure. No one, not even Karen, could ever underestimate the power of standing up for what was right. The neighborhood would never be the same again, and neither would they.